Good morning and welcome. Welcome to Hilfield. I recognise lots of faces, but there are some people who may not have been, I don't think have been here before. And if it's your first time, a very special welcome to Hilfield for this day. A particular welcome to Professor Michael Northcott, who's with us. He's actually with us for a few days here at the Friary, and who is also a good friend of ours. And we're enormously grateful for him coming here. He's an eminent professor of ethics at Edinburgh University, and a teacher of theology and ethics, and particularly in regard to the environment and the issues around that, but the politics and the economics and everything to do with that. And this day particularly focusing on some of those issues which are very present to us at the moment.
Hello everyone, it's great to be with you here in this beautiful county of Dorset, and what I think of as the old heart of England. But first I just want us to stand up in our places wherever we are, and just kind of get a bit of ease in our bodies. Maybe move your arms, get a sense of energy contained in your body. We're going to be mainly aiming for here for a few minutes. But the body is, and the mind is in the body, and half of our problems as a civilization is if we only think in terms of minds, either our minds or the minds of a machine, like a computer or a digital banking account or whatever it is, then level multi. So let's think of ourselves, our brains in our bodies, and the power of God's Spirit, as I believe that enables us to dwell as conscious beings in these bodies of ours. And I just want you to close your eyes for a second and think about the fact that as you're all kind of standing there, maybe jiggling around a bit, your feet, the soles of your feet are planted on the ground. They are planted on the earth. We have different names for the earth. We might call it cosmos. We might call it creation. We might call her Gaia. We might join Pope Francis and Saint Francis in calling her Mother Earth. We came from the earth. We are of the earth. Part of us is animal, body, instinct, senses, feeling. But don't think about the top of your head, where all that consciousness tends to be focused. Feel the sky above your head. Imagine the stars that we can't see in the daylight, but hopefully we might see tonight. Imagine Sister Moon, Brother Sun, as St. Francis called them. From the earth, we receive life. Without plants, we would not have had breakfast, and we won't get lunch. Without photosynthesis, from the sun, from the heavens. Without rain, from the sky. Without wind, moisture in the air itself. Without oxygen, without carbon dioxide, without nitrogen, the plants couldn't grow. And the other creatures that share the plants with us couldn't live there either. Consciousness and body, heaven and earth, Gaia and souls. These are the economy. These are the divine economy. She gives us life. Let's begin just by giving thanks for all it is and all that will be today. Amen. Amen. So devices, 3 devices. A microphone, a projector, computer, and a device that hopefully will link them all together, as well as my brain, hopefully. So, I'm hoping you can all see that, and that you can all see me. I'm wondering where the best place is for me to stand, so I don't get in the way of it. Let's think. How about, if I stand here, does that interrupt the vision for some of you? Is that all right? Great. Well, I'll stand in front of the stage, so I often like to stand in front of the stage, whether they're on or not. So I've called this talk Brexit, Trump, and the Global Common Good. And on the picture there is the building in which I work some of the time. I'm currently on research leave, so I'm not there very much, but I do work there. It's New College. It was for a while the location of the Scottish Parliament before they built a Spanish concrete shed at the bottom of the Royal Mile, which some of us loathe and some of us apparently love. It's an amazing building, and it's a faculty of theology. Though increasingly it's a school of religion, which means we've become much more outward-facing. That's a good thing. So, in the last few months, maybe in the last year, we've realised that these words global and common and good are not as obviously part of everyone's way of thinking as we perhaps once had thought. We're told that Theresa May believes in the common good. But then she also said that if you were a citizen of the world, you couldn't be a citizen of a country. And for us as Christians, we're, I think, first and foremost citizens of heaven. For people of a more earth-oriented faith, in my experience, they too tend to be thinking of themselves as the children of Gaia, not just citizens of England or something. There's nothing wrong with being a citizen of England, but it's not the whole of our identity. And so, to some of us, it was quite surprising that someone who thinks of the common good could kind of put in a binary divide, having a sense of being of the world, of Gaia, of Mother Earth, of the global, and being a member of a nation like England. And so partly I'm just trying to think through in these talks, where did that alienation come from? And hopefully as the day proceeds, we might start to think about how we might overcome that alienation. Now, if you lived before about 1950, the majority of people, well over 90% of people, probably I think it's 95% of people born before 1950, dwelled in one place their whole life. And the radius of their acquaintance, this is before computers and the internet and email, of course it could take place through correspondence, but the typical radius of face-to-face communication was 20 miles. The bicycle played a big role, of course, in mixing up genes in the late 19th and early 20th century. It had a huge effect, actually, on human development, far more than the motor car, which came much later and arguably has had the opposite effect in some curious ways. But it's really interesting how quickly, as a species, we've gone from being a local species to a global species. And I met someone just before I came in who just come back from Chiang Mai and is about to go off to Dallas. And if you said this to someone from 1950, it just wouldn't really have computed that people could live like that. But if you go back even further to a Yanomami village in the Amazon rainforest, the sense of world is still very much local. So for people who live in villages like this, the world is the area in which they hunt and gather. Typically a day's walk, and possibly including an overnight camp. So again, we're talking about 20 or 30 miles radius from the settlement. And the known world may be extending out to 50 or 100 miles radius at most. So humans were much more like other species at one time. Most species don't have great ranges And one of our ecological problems is we've introduced non-native species where they don't belong, and they run wild in ways we had not anticipated, and wiped out other species, as those of you may be involved in trying to spot and conserve red squirrels in the current campaign may be aware. But having a sense of ourselves situated very locally produces this thing is a little, I'm still learning to use this device. Let's get back one, see if we can get it back. What I want now is the words. Come on, device. There they are. Very good. So, what I think we've learned in the last few months is that there is a global way of thinking, acting, and speaking is contested. And some of the people it is contested by are called the globally left behind. I use the phrase globally wasted. I saw a phrase used in the Spectator yesterday, or was it the New Statesman? The shrinking people. I didn't quite know what that meant, but I think Left Behind probably gets it better, and I also like the kind of metaphorical overlap with another word, meaning of that word in certain circles. So the left behind, or globally wasted, were communities of people who did have work, and it was located in their communities, and the work departed to other shores, other places, and they no longer had work. I used to live in the northeast of England as a student, and one of the places I realised that it was likely that people would vote to leave Europe was when I spoke a year ago in the northeast of England, and I was astonished how much hostility I found there to Europe. And it just didn't have occurred to me in cities in Britain that people would be opposed to Europe. And as we know, Sunderland was the first to vote out. And much of the northeast went with Sunderland, including Middlesbrough and Washington, all of whom stand aloof from leaving Europe. But they had a sense that being global has not worked for them. It's taken power away from the northeast of England. It used to be the powerhouse, along with the northwest. That enormous seam of coal which the bishops of Durham for so many centuries benefited considerably from, the prince bishops, was what drove London, was what drove the Industrial Revolution. Coal was called sea coal because it came from Newcastle to London, and there was a street called Sea Coal in London named such in the 14th century. So the North East has played an absolutely seminal role in powering England for 700 years. And now it's like, oh, we don't need the North East of England anymore. I mean, so people go, we don't need you. That seems to be the feeling that they have now. And they didn't really, I mean, to me, they're not really blaming Brussels, they're blaming Whitehall. They're blaming the decision of global corporations to relocate what used to be made in the North East to China, to India, and so on. And so, globally wasted, the globally left behind, the deindustrialized communities. And it was very similar in the United States. Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump polled well in places like Cincinnati and Cleveland, Ohio, the left behind, and Detroit, and Baltimore. And there's a reason for that. They both spoke critically against the tendency to assume that unmitigated economic freedom for corporations to do what the heck they want with human beings and human communities, and I will add with the Earth's resources, had not turned out to be very freeing for them. So, and of course it was political representatives like Sanders, but more influentially as things turned out, Farage in this country and Trump in the States, who garnered that vote in ways that some of us may find rather ambiguous and problematic, but nonetheless, that was that vote that drove it. As I've said though, for hunter-gatherers, their world is a world, but it's a world encompassed by a circle of little more than 40 kilometres. Whereas we can go to a supermarket now and hunt and gather. And there's blueberries in the winter from Peru, and strawberries from Spain, and lettuces probably also from Spain, and oranges from Israel, and bananas from Guatemala, and coffee from Ethiopia, Guatemala, and goodness knows where else, Nicaragua and everywhere. So I think one way to think of our current predicament as a species is that we haven't actually caught up mentally, or at least not everyone has caught up, mentally and economically, with this new global. Many people are still living where they've always lived. They don't want to get on their bike, as some of us might remember as a politician commending to people when they found that the jobs had left their community. They don't want to. They were raised in a pit village. They want to die in a pit village. That's their life. They're still in the working men's club, so there's no work for the working men. And in one sense, I think we need just to say there's nothing wrong with that. That's how most people have lived throughout human history and pre-recorded history, and that's how most animals live, most other species live. It's okay. We should have found that. Even if we are cosmopolitans, we should have found the right of people to live locally, and not only globally. But you don't have to, seems to me, have a binary divide. You know, as I get older, I'm less and less interested in binary divides. I don't mind whether we're a Catholic or a Buddhist or a Protestant. Are you in touch with yourself? Are you in touch with your neighbour? Can you show love? Do you love the earth? Is that what your tradition encourages? That interests me much more. I don't want to know. The first question should not be, oh, so what is your precise tradition? Can we communicate? That's a much more interesting issue. One of the most powerful devices for turning the world global was a metal box. It was invented by a North Carolinian shipping magnate in 1958. This is the container port of Newark, New Jersey. It's almost apocalyptic in scale, and it is taken on a dark, cloudy day, which adds to that sense. But behind it, you can also see the chimney stacks of oil-burning power stations helping to keep the lights on in Manhattan and Brooklyn and so on. And these metal boxes carry everything, including some species, but obviously by the time they're in them, they're generally plucked, around the world, including that device over there that's projecting this image, including this microphone into which I'm speaking, including the phone which is controlling the computer. All of them came there, and probably also the computer stand in a metal box like that. And although this community attends carefully to where it sources things, so for example, when I visited Caleb, who is working in the joiner's shop right now, I was looking at his plywood and I wanted to know where it came from. And we checked, and it was forestry commissions, a forestry certificate wood, but it did come from China. But when it comes to what's inside a metal box and who put it together, it's very hard to be quite so discerning. So the metal box led to a situation in which we have a global economy which functions globally and not locally. And in some ways this is new. It's new in the industrial era, in the sense that an object constructed now, even if it's put together in Britain, may have parts in it that have come from 20 different countries. So those motor cars that are put together in that factory in the northeast have bits in them from China, minerals in them, and rare earth minerals if they've got batteries in them from one or two places in Asia, including Malaysia where I once lived, even possibly from Africa. And then they have copper from a mine, quite possibly in Africa. They have plastic from oil, which might have come who knows where, shale or oil in Alberta, or more likely from Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, computers, computer chips, silicon, huge numbers of species contributing in different ways, some of them millions of years old, put down in the crust of the earth, that finally ended up in a Nissan Leaf that's sitting outside there,
We don't really think of these things as animate objects, except when we drag them around with oil in them, but they originate from other animate objects. It was the earth that put down the sedimentary rocks and the layers and the crust of the earth moving around that's given us all these minerals that we now extract and know how to use. But the metal box wasn't the first moment in human history when people felt almost more global than local. Before there were nations, there were tribes, and after there were tribes, there were peoples united by empires. And the Bible tells the story of these. The first book of the Bible is a story of how we went from being hunter-gatherers to imperial slaves. It ends in the garden, and it begins in the garden in freedom, and ends with feudalism, and the opening chapter of Exodus is slavery. So that book of the Bible takes us from right from the beginning, where we were as a species for 200,000 years or more, to the birth of agriculture, to the division of labour, which made possible complex civilizations like that of Egypt, whose remains are still visible in the world today. So we have known empires before, and arguably the most significant empire in human history, and in fact, in terms of its endurance, was the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, it endured far longer than the Roman Empire. And it's given many of us in Europe our sense of world. I mean, if you look at the boundaries of the European Union right now, it is roughly the boundary of the Holy Roman Empire, which of course did actually include most of Britain up to Hadrian's Wall, but in fact there was another wall further north still, so it's got quite a lot of Scotland was included in the Roman Empire, and then the Holy Roman Empire afterwards. So it would be wrong to say that modern technology and industrialism are the only source of our sense of world. So, but what's happened is that modern technology has alienated people from that larger sense of world that we have in our faith traditions, most of us, if we belong to a global communion like the Christian Church, or indeed Buddhism, which is another quite global religion, or Islam. So I'm not going to suggest that we shouldn't think global, because we've, in one sense, been global citizens before we were members of nations. And that's certainly true here in Britain. I mean, when it was King Alfred who first thought of England as a nation, but it wasn't really King Alfred, it was Bede. And Bede read his ecclesiastical history, and he was having problems with the Danes, and he was having internal problems, and he thought it would be a good idea to get Wessex or Northumbria and the other two together. And, well, the rest is history. So our sense of nation does go back longer, and that may be part of our problem that any other nation in the current European Union. We have been a nation for a remarkably long time, but it was because of Bede, it was because of a monk who was a member of an order which was part of the Holy Roman Empire in one shape or another. So this is Romania. Romania is in now the European Union. A number of Romanians now in this country looking for work, or in work. I meet some in the hospitality trade, for example. I met a Romanian and had an interesting conversation with her about the beauty of Transylvania in a Lake District hotel in Langdale, I think it was, a year ago. But Romania also is having its issues with the European Union. Yeah, they're receiving aid. But what's the condition for the development aid they receive? So this is as close as one can get to a pre-modern, pre-organic, but pre-chemical farm. Then there's a lot of farming like this still going on in Romania. Much like this area, you can see they've still got forests, but they've got arable grasslands, they've got barns, and they're also ploughing. So all these different things are all going on in a quite small area. The old days when my Uncle Dick was a mixed farmer had largely gone here, but they endured there. And as a result, they have an extraordinary array of species still all around their farmlands. It's one of the ecologically most diverse settled parts of the European Union. But the European Union's Commission's conditions for giving out development aid are that the countries that receive it should become more able to receive metal boxes. So they are driving roads through the Caucasus, they are driving tunnels through precious landscapes, which will impact on ecosystems in that region. And what is, of course, driving this vision of an economy as an economy where everything is free to move around has been is, and it's still enduring, it hasn't really gone away despite Brexit and Trump's criticism and Sandra's criticism, what is sometimes called neoliberalism. The idea of neoliberalism began in a book written by a man called Lippmann called The Good Society, and it was a paean written in the 30s in the United States against collectivization by the state of human activities. So he was living in the New Deal era, which was a response to the Great Depression, when great highways were constructed and bridges. Basically, the American freeway system was put down then as a project to employ unemployed people who were made unemployed by problems in the financial economy in Wall Street. And there are many other aspects of the collectivization of the American economy in the New Deal. There were similar collective projects going on in Europe as a response to the financial collapse. And there was an emergent, of course, you also had China on the horizon already as a collectivized communist economy. So this book was written to reassert individual freedom and personal virtue and law and doing right as an ethic, or really a Christian ethic. It's not explicitly a Christian book, but a lot of what it says is kind of traditional Christianity. But out of that protest against collectivization, which was magnified by a man called Ferdinand Hayek, you got this new economic philosophy which we call neoliberalism. So it was a reassertion of liberalism, the 19th century idea of the individual as a free individual person. And in some ways then it was a philosophical as well as an economic set of ideas. And initially it was just a group of people who used to meet in a place called Mont Pelerin in Switzerland. They met every other year. The eminence grise was Ferdinand Hayek, but people like Keynes and others all went along to this society. In the early days it wasn't at all influential, but it gradually grew and grew. The Chicago Economics School became very closely identified with it, and of course Milton Friedman, who Keith Josephs read in promoting Margaret Thatcher as a leader of the Conservative Party. And of course now neoliberalism as an ideology is prominent in China, it's prominent in India, as well as in the European Commission and in much of Europe and in North America and beyond. So this small set of ideas, reasserting an Enlightenment idea of the individual as a kind of atomistic being, a sort of billiard ball, who goes around the world garnering resources to serve his or her own needs, without giving too much thought to the collective, or to community, or to how the earth had birthed him or her. This reassertion of individual freedom turned out to be one of the most influential intellectual developments of the late 20th century, and we're still living with it. I think some of us thought the global financial crash would lead to a crash in the prevalence of the ideals of neoliberalism, but far from it. The Conservative Party, the Conservative government last year, 2015, privatised more assets in the United Kingdom than the government had privatised in the previous 10 years. So it hasn't gone away. In fact, the current Whitehall and Westminster administration is as neoliberal as any we've had since Keith Joseph's and Margaret Thatcher's time, and it's actually pursuing that neoliberalism far more effectively, but quietly. Margaret Thatcher used to preach about it. She thought you needed to persuade people with rhetoric and carry them along, and only then could you do it. But this lot, no, they're just going to quietly do it. They're not going to tell us about it. It's almost like they're not proud of it anymore, but they're going to do it anyway. behind our backs. They're going to sell all the universities to private companies. They want to sell all the schools to private companies. They want to sell the water. Well, they already have. But why? What's that about? To me, neoliberalism is why the global has become almost an insult to a lot of people. But then to hear it in the mouth of one of our most neoliberal advocates, Theresa May, is really weird. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. So the infrastructure then of containerized movement, as I put it here, displaces not only human communities, but it also displaces nature. It displaces sustainable communities and sustainable ways of interacting with other species, such as Romanian agriculture. And it destroys a sense of place, and it destroys place attachment. And it even makes place attachment look, oh God, you know, how old-fashioned. Provincial, think of the words like provincial, parochial. That's a real insult, isn't it? Oh, it's so parochial. You go to this church, you know, there's this church down in, I don't know, the depths of Dorset, and they're so parochial, you know. And it's kind of an insult. I coined a phrase in my first kind of big book, The Environment and Christian Ethics, the phrase parochial ecology. We academics, we like to feel sometimes we coin phrases and they're sort of ours. I feel that's my phrase, parochial ecology, because I was trying to do the opposite. I was trying to say, no, actually, many ecosystems, many species are parochial. They're not global. Yeah, the climate system is a global system. We know that. But even some of the things we call global warming are often local. So, for example, when the snows melted on the top of Mount Kilimanjaro, people blame global warming. Well, no, actually it was deforestation on the slopes of Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania that caused the snows to melt. It wasn't actually a global temperature rise. So even in science, it's very important to try to distinguish between global effects and local effects. And the issue of scale in conservation science is terribly important. And the lack of attention to scale in economics, I think, is a major, major problem. And of course, it was E.F. Schumacher, who was originally a coal economist, in his wonderful book, Small is Beautiful, which is still the most extraordinary book. I think it's subtitled something like The Buddhist Economics, but it's just, if you've never read it, it's just one of the books you really have to read in this life, along with Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. Anyway, you're not my undergraduates, but I would recommend them both, along with, as well as other things I've written, of course. But liberal trade displaces place attachment. It makes it look old, romantic. And then, of course, the protests, which began in the 18th century, against that was to reassert the value of place. And the Lake District was where that protest began. And many of us in England who go there, it's still an amazing place. But I advise you only to go in the winter now because of all the tourists. So deindustrialization then did not, however, even though it was promoted by neoliberal ideas of global freedom and global trade, did not displace people any more than introduced species displace other species. They don't so much displace them, they don't force them to move elsewhere, they extinct them. They put them to death. They shrink their available food supply. They shrink the money available in the community. That's what we've done. So these are shrinking communities. They've shrunk. If you had a Venn diagram of the influence of the Northeast on the British economy, it's gone from being an enormous circle to being a tiny spot. So it's a shrinking place. It's felt, but it's shrunk. And it doesn't like it, and who can blame it? But what it finds is, what the Northeast finds is, they no longer have the powers either to revive the old place economy, because it's quite hard to do that when it's gone. So, inevitably, right across Europe, this kind of conflict between neoliberalism and people in place has produced protests. I mean, one of the things neoliberalism has done is to teach us that money is a very wonderful and fluid device for moving things around. So if you want to move things around, you have to translate more and more of what is on the earth, or is extracted from the earth, into money values, because money valuables are fungible, endlessly translatable. Once they're fungible, they can be moved very easily. And then the stuff follows the money. And so the more you can turn directly into a commodity, the more you make the earth and people and places available for commoditization, for marketization. So if your idea of freedom is freedom to trade, just that, then this is the thing to do. Everything in this country, ultimately, should have a price tag on it. That's why the NHS is failing. It is not just the lack of social care and the lack of funds for that. It's because the endeavour to put a price tag on every swab in the NHS and every interpersonal interaction is incredibly expensive. It costs billions to do it. You have to employ large numbers of accountants and people with boards and phones going around counting every action and seeing how long it took and how much time. It's the taylorization of the NHS, and it's being taylorized because they want to sell it, to marketize it. It's not going to happen tomorrow. It's a long-term project. But at the moment, the NHS is failing because that project, to turn it into a set of saleable commodities, is in conflict with the public service ethic and arguably with the Christian ethic, from which the idea of hospital, there's still pilgrim hostels in Canterbury to this day, from which that idea first came. It's in conflict, I would argue, with Christian ethics. So this claim neoliberalism is somehow getting us back to a moral ideal has gone to an extreme where it's no longer really correct to say that it's more moral, it's less moral, it seems to me. So the European single market, in many ways, was the creation of this neoliberal vision. One of its most powerful advocates was, of course, our own Margaret Thatcher. She didn't sign the Maastricht Treaty with her arm behind her back. Her Maastricht speech, pre-signing it, was a laudatory account of the free trade and the freedoms that it will bring to people of Europe, and that the same policies ought to bring to the world. It was a Tory aristocrat. I think it was a Rees-Mogg, but I can't remember. I can look it up afterwards. Who went to Brussels to persuade the Commission, and especially the Germans, who were pretty reluctant, and the French, it must be said, of the value of a single market, of taking down the barriers. So the French put in all these rules about what can be called champagne and camembert and Roquefort, and the Germans insisted that their guilds stayed in place, and the Italians some similar things in relation to, Asti Spumante, or what is that thing we all drink now? Carver? No, there's another one, isn't there? Yes, there you are. So, but once those rules were in place, of course, Thatcher didn't want to make a case for Wensleydale. Not interested in the Yorkshire, But once they were all in place, and we've got all these, exceptions in for the French and the Germans and the Italians, then it went ahead. And so the most globalized economies in Europe were ones that fought the least for barriers to this new market, particularly Britain, but also Spain, Portugal, which had not long been democratic and previously been fascist. And Greece, of course, came very late to the party and had also been fascist because Winston Churchill, after the war, decided that socialists were too dangerous, and though they'd fought the Nazis, they shouldn't form a government. And the story of Greece, I'm afraid, goes back to that appalling decision, just like the story of Israel goes back to another set of appalling decisions. We in Britain do have a lot to account for in our recent history. So the European single market's advocacy, then, of this neoliberal idea of freedom, freedom as movement, freedom as speed, freedom as moving money from bank account to offshore tax haven, to private island, to yacht. That neoliberal idea of freedom was enshrined at the heart of the European project as a result of the advocacy, I would argue, above all, of the British Conservative Party, which at the time was completely neoliberal, and in its current government policy still is. I said once in an article in the Church Times that in the daytime, Conservatives are neoliberals, and at night, when they go home to their constituents at the weekend, they cross-dress as economic nationalists. But it's something they dare not admit to in public, but only in their constituencies and in WI meetings. There's a great deal of cross-dressing, and not the usual kind, going on amongst Conservative politicians in this respect. So, the problem, though, is that once you make money free, people become unfree. Money becomes the god. And as we know from the Bible, if you worship Moloch, people are sacrificed. Children are sacrificed. Communities are sacrificed. Adults are sacrificed. Species are sacrificed. Communities are sacrificed. So it hasn't led to freedom. It hasn't led to more security, to more resilience. It's actually led to a disequalization in the distribution of income. As those who have the instruments of control over the money system have acquired more money, and those who don't are having less. Assets are basically being stripped from local communities and parceled up into wealth ownership for an international, global, cosmopolitan elite. And this, of course, has built resentment. So these people here are in Spain. This is the Ignatios movement in Spain that took place in the course of the global financial crash. It led in turn to the Occupy movement, but the protest actually began in Spain, in a Spanish-speaking country, and then it spread to the Occupy movement in New York and DC and a number of other cities, and right across Europe, including into the city of Edinburgh, where I live at least some of the time. So global trade then moves money around. But as I said already, it also moves non-native species around to places where they wipe out native non-humans in other ecosystems, like the red squirrel. Nature is not well adapted, but arguably neither are human communities. This is one human community in which we are currently situated, which I think Hilfield is kind of reviving a local economy in everything it's trying to do right now, and I'm full of admiration for Hilfield, including extending the land, and influence over the land to fields nearby. One day I'd love to drive or cycle, as I did last time when I came here in the summer, from the nearest town and know that the forest surrounding Hilfield is also now belonging to Hilfield. Wouldn't that be wonderful? But to me, this revival of a monastic economy, though this is a friary, not a monastery, and I do know the difference, but nonetheless, let's just use that word for a moment, it's a broader term. This revival of a monastic community is a religious witness to a sustainable, local, but also Christian, also global, world-oriented, earth-oriented, universal church-oriented, heaven-oriented, but also earth-oriented movement. It's a revival of all those things. There's no binary divide at Hilfield. You meet people from a number of different countries in the community here when you come, and that's one of the joys of Hilfield. But at the same time, it's a deeply rooted community, and they are trying to live off local energy sources and trying to grow as much as they can with their own food. This, in fact, is a picture which I didn't ask everyone's permission, but I'm hoping no one would be upset. I know everybody in the picture. Where we went up on Ascension Day, last time I was here, and sang a hymn, overlooking the plot, and said some prayers, and it was just a wonderful occasion. But of course, religious communities, religious customs, discourses, dialects, traditions, rituals, are part of the panoply of cultural artifacts that human beings all over the world have developed to help them to live sustainably in place. So there's a very famous essay by an anthropologist called Roy Rappaport called Pigs for the Ancestors. It was published in the journal Science in 1967. It was a study of a tribe in Papua New Guinea who worship pigs, so we call them animists, I guess. PNG has the largest diversity of languages of any country in the world, and the largest diversity of species. And there's a reason that it's sometimes called the biolinguistic hypothesis. So when you have the more diversity of human cultures you have, the more diversity of languages you have, the easier it is for people to live with and to sustain a diversity of creatures around them. So what he found in this, what he described in this scientific paper was that the ceremonies around the pigs and the slaughtering of the pigs kept the number of pigs that they kept in these quite fragile ecosystems of the tropical rainforest down to the carrying capacity of the forest. He did all the numbers, that's why it was in Science and not in an anthropology journal. And he found that a religious ritual helped the people to live sustainably in place. So the ritual had evolved along with the ecosystem, along with the people, over hundreds, possibly thousands of years. But that's also why I think it's wonderful that what is being brought back here is an economy over 1,000 years old. And I think that it's quite possible that we'll find the ways to live in the present and the future, at least in part by looking back to the ways that we lived in the past. And yes, this is romantique. This is to look back, to be present, and to be hopeful about the future. There's nothing wrong with that. Quite the opposite. This, again, it's this, oh, that's the old way of doing things, you know. Neoliberalism does not like tradition. It doesn't like professions. It doesn't like craft guilds. It doesn't like anything which has been around for 1,000 years in the form of a human custom or tradition, because it gets in the way of the free movement of people and money and goods and services, and I would add species. So there is a religious, a spiritual dimension to this, as well as an economic one. And I see I'm only on slide 8. I don't quite know how I've managed that. But anyway, I think we've got till 11:30 at least, before I envisage stopping talking. If my voice holds up, it would be great to have a glass of water. I'm just realising that would be very helpful. So if we go back to the idea of global for a minute, probably the most powerful image of global was this image, which came to us in the 1970s. So this, as Pink Floyd well put it in a famous album of theirs, some of you might remember, I noticed a few of you who've got hair, as little hair as I, called Dark Side of the Moon. So this is Earthrise from the dark side of the moon. So on point, the astronauts were around the other side of the moon and they couldn't see the Earth. They couldn't see home. They were in this endless vacuum of space. And they knew that all they had between them and death was a few inches, probably less than that, an inch maybe, of precious metal and an oxygen capsule, basically. And then they came around the other side and they saw home again. And they fell in love with Earth all over again for the first time. And when they brought this image back, many of us fell in love with it too all over again. Because you see Mother Earth, as Pope Francis rightly calls her after St. Francis, just hanging there in space. How precious she is, how fragile. And just to remind us how fragile, there's the Saharan desert bang in the middle of the picture. Let's not turn the Earth back into that. The picture seems to be saying to us. But that idea of global has got mixed up with this neoliberal global. So deindustrialized populations are suspicious of global logics, given their experiences of global wasting. In the same decades in which this other global phenomenon, which I think was more correctly named global warming than climate change, was announced by cosmopolitan, scientifically educated elites. And when they find they're paying more for their electricity, because the grid is run by the French, and it still will be after we've left the European Union, by the way, so we won't leave it if we leave it. We simply don't have any influence anymore over the laws that determine what the foreigners do who run this country on our behalf. How insane is that? Have people not heard of the phrase political economy? We have a political economy. So if you leave the political assembly where economic matters are regulated, what you do is reduce the control of the British people, reduce their sovereignty over the economy. And that's been sold to us in the name of giving us more control. I mean, you really couldn't make it up. It's no wonder that George Orwell's 1984 has become a bestseller all over again. It isn't just America where you have untruth spoken as truth. We have had that right throughout the Brexit campaign, and we've had it for 9 months since. It's absolute. We hear untruths uttered every single day now by politicians, including in the government, including, I'm afraid to say, I think, our Prime Minister, though she's not here to defend herself, I fully recognise that. But the result of this is that Brexiteers think they will get back control over their lives by reducing immigration to the UK of non-native persons. But there's no proposal that non-native corporations will no longer be able to buy our infrastructure. This is Thirlmere Reservoir. Now, Thirlmere is the place where the British conservation movement really began. Because Thomas Carlyle and William Wordsworth and John Ruskin and a few other people you might have heard of all joined a society to defend Thirlmere from the Manchester City Corporation that wanted to turn it into a water store to give clean water, as they well had needed to do, to the people currently dying rapidly in slums from polluted water in the industrial city of Manchester. So they fought the dam. They fought the idea that this will become industrial infrastructure. Now, so if you drive along Thirlmere today, you might look at it and think, well, I really see the problem here. Well, the water was raised, what was it, about 20, 30 feet? There was a proposal to raise it even higher, and that was defeated, partly because of the influence of the Thermal Defence Society went on, and eventually led to the Common Space Defence Movement, and then ultimately to the National Trust, which, by the way, was first proposed by an English vicar called Canon Halbert Wolseley. Not a well-known fact, and not one that the National Trust likes to preach about. I don't like the idea that it was a vicar who founded them. But I'm trying to persuade them otherwise in a project I'm working on at the moment, hopefully with them. But my point is, I thought, well, who owns Thirlmere now? So I looked it up, and it belongs to something called United Utilities. Now, at that point, I could, you just find it out on Google, but you could find out who owns United Utilities. So where are the shareholders? Where does the board meet? It could meet in Madrid, for all I know. So how does leaving Brussels give us Thirlmere back? I just don't get it. I mean, it's completely, it is a lie. It is a non-truth, a falsehood. What do we call it now? Fake news. But that's the main, so the government now is promoting fake news every single day. So they're sustaining the misleading rhetoric that persuaded the people of Sunderland that the way to get back the local was to allow the global to continue to destroy their community with a free, neoliberal, free trading, unprotected economy at the same time as reducing the ability of British civil servants to influence the laws which run and determine what is done by foreign corporations to places like Sunderland. It is insane. Well, before Brexit, I wrote a book called Place, Ecology and the Sacred, The Moral Geography of Sustainable Communities. And in the book, I argued that we needed to get back to thinking about what a local economy is. I didn't suggest it was the only economy we needed, but I suggested it was an economy we needed to learn more about. Now, what I find really incredible is that despite promising to organise Brexit and to take back control of British affairs, British politicians and civil servants, in my experience, and it's reasonable, I'm a professor in a government city. So I interact with these people, and I attended a meeting just a month afterwards, drawn together by Rosanna Kahneman, the Great and the Good. I don't know how they got my name, but anyway, I went along, and we were asked in a group of about 60 to all sit around and talk about the threats and the opportunities of Brexit. To the environment, to communities, to rural affairs. That was the kind of brief. And what I found incredible, I sat down and we had to write post-it notes, and I was in the group that had to propose the opportunities. And I wrote about 20 post-it notes of what I saw as because I'd thought about this local economy thing for quite some time. And I started sharing this with a group. I remember there was a director of the Botanic Gardens there at the time from Edinburgh, where a lot of people, CEOs and civil servants. And when I said something like, well, Brexit will mean that instead of employing Romanians to do the work we need to do in Glasgow, we actually will educate the de-skilled, de-industrialised people who are still living on the dole in Govan. Brexit will mean that instead of importing 60% of our food from places like Peru, Bolivia, Guatemala and Spain, we'll need to cover a great deal of the central belt of Scotland and parts of England in plastic, like they do, for example, in South Korea, because South Korea is situated between two world powers, Japan and China, and they know they need to be able to grow their own food and not rely on those two world powers. We will grow our own food again. And they just looked at me like I was mad. And I realised then, these people have no idea what a local economy is anymore. Some years ago, too many anecdotes, I need to move on. No, I'll tell you what anyway. I was at St George's House, Windsor, and I gave another speech along these lines about free trade and the WTO. And the WTO is basically an invention of Bill Clinton and Al Gore. And it was their way of trying to exercise control over a neoliberal global economy. I mean, Clinton and Gore were neoliberals. But they wanted at the same time to give America the economic advantage. So they created the WTO. It included all the American let-out courses about American corn, American oil, American agriculture, American textiles, American cars, all of them. And that was the baseline. Nobody else joined once America got all its special privileges. But now if you join, you don't have any privileges. So it's very, very clever. But it was a device just to kind of persuade the world neoliberalism at the same time as giving America the key advantage in it. After the talk, I did two things. One, the American Trade Commissioner was actually there from the American Embassy, and he asked a very entertaining and very funny question. He said, "I'm just wondering if the speaker has sold the film rights to his talk yet." So you see what he was saying there, this is fiction. He just made it up, but it's entertaining, you know. We'll make a good film. It's obviously not true. It's very clever, diplomats, very good with words. But my point, and I remember a civil servant there at lunch saying, you can't get back to a local food economy. People don't want to grow food anymore. People don't have anything to do with the growing food anymore. But actually, 10 years on, if you interviews mass survey data shows that there's something like a third of British people are involved in some way or another in growing and harvesting food. Yeah, they don't want to go into the windy, cold fields, wet fields of East Anglia and pick up beets for a sugar beet factory. I don't blame them. They probably don't want to pick strawberries on a vast industrial farm. But they like taking their kids to go and pick strawberries at the farm down the road. They like having a plot of herbs in their back garden. They like having an allotment. Most cities have huge queues. In Edinburgh, they're more than 10 years long waiting times to get an allotment, though it's a government responsibility to provide everyone with an allotment who asks for one. That's one of the freedoms neoliberals, they don't seem to be very keen on. And the civil servants are, in my experience now, nearly all neoliberals. This is not just one party's ideology. This is the governing ideology. And this is the really weird thing about Brexit and Trump. To be honest, I think Trump is at least more, I mean, this is a weird thing for me to say, but if you read his speech to Congress, now clearly he didn't write it, because it's far too well joined up piece of rhetoric, but if you read it, and it's worth reading. I read it last night, because I've been on retreat for weeks, so I haven't read any news, which has been great, actually, because the whole Brexit-Trump thing had a very bad effect on me, and I was looking at the news far too often. I had a week, and I literally could not look at it, and it was fantastic. I do recommend it. If anybody's depressed about Brexit and Trump, just stop looking at the phone, stop reading newspapers, turn Radio 4 off. Yeah? We need sometimes just to stop listening to all this terrible stuff. But you come into there because you want to hear about it. I understand that. But I did begin with a spiritual practice and not talking about Brexit and Trump. And we'll try to end with one too. But my point is, the British elite have got us into this mess. David Cameron in particular has got us into this mess. Cameron's got no idea. Why would he be interested in a local economy? Where did he get his money from? His father knows very well how to manipulate money between London and tax havens. And that's how he has wealth. That's got nothing to do with the local economy. It's to do with neoliberalism, the freedom of money, the freedom of the rich to steal from the poor and to steal from the earth. And Pope Francis comes very close to saying that in Laudato Si. Because he says the environmental crisis is about rich people taking their God-given assets from poor people. So, for example, he says, he didn't use the word crime, but he says I think he uses the word immoral, or it's certainly against the law of God, that water should belong to private companies. So that's why some Americans called it a Marxist encyclical, because it's not just about the environment, but it's about the causes of our environmental crisis, and that the implication of that is that it's a fundamental part of the cause is that rich people have stolen the economy of the earth from poor people in place. The question, though, is, of course, how might we revive a local economy? And we're going to think about that more this afternoon interactively. But in the book, I argue, I chase down a number of possible avenues. But what I do say is that I think, a little mnemonic I have: food, fibre and fuel. You can't get rare earths from Sussex. You can't get uranium from Devon. Well, there's a radon gas in Devon. There's no uranium, as far as I know, or if there is, it's not economically viable amounts of it. You can't get oil in sufficient quantities anymore. Well, you probably could, just for the plastics that we use in the NHS and in other parts of our lives. But we need to get off making plastic. So, food, fibre and fuel. If we just had a government strategy to reshore, so you've heard of offshore, so there's another word, it's called reshore. It's actually what Trump is wanting to do. I mean, I don't know who wrote that speech, but whoever wrote that speech has a strategy. They have a plan. No speech of our Prime Minister, to me, gives me any sense that she has any plan whatsoever, except to stop me teaching foreign students. Because she insisted that they be called migrants, and they were included in the migrant count. It's unbelievable. The migrant count was 300,000 people right through the campaign. At a crucial moment in the campaign, I've read the account by David Cameron's press secretary of the campaign. At a crucial moment, a horrendous figure came through, something like 310,000. One half of that figure was foreign students. As far as I know, no other country in Europe calls foreign students migrants. It's completely insane to include them in the migrant count. My PhD students don't come here to stay. They come here to acquire a love for the English language, a love for English academia, a love for English or Scottish people. I do mainly teach in Scotland now. And then they take that love home with them. And then they continue to interact with me from North America or mainland China or Singapore or Malaysia. And they invite me out there. That's very nice too. And they carry on buying British goods. On Sunderland Polytechnic, where I worked many years ago, we had a pharmacy PhD program. We trained pharmacists. And then they went back to developing countries and bought British drugs. So migrants is complete nonsense. They're one of the most valuable invisible earnings this country brings in. And they don't just stop when they leave. The invisible earnings continue throughout the life, the professional life of the foreign student and the influence they exercise. Because they continue, if we treated them well, to love Britain. I just can't understand it. It's completely insane. And that person is now our Prime Minister. The person who insisted that we include students in the migrant camp, which is one of the main reasons that Cameron lost the referendum. And Cameron also is not, frankly, I don't think, a very strategic thinker, and that's being nice. Cameron also didn't address that issue. Unbelievable. How did I get there? Food, fibre and fuel. So take building materials. So you might say to me, well, we've only got 2 steel factories left, so how on earth could we build all our concrete steel structures with the steel factories we've got left? I think Paul Talbot's still going, I think it is, in South Wales, just about being saved for now. There's one other, I think. I mean, there's remarkably little steel-making capacity left. But you can now build skyscrapers with engineered wood. You don't need steel anymore, because we've got technologies now to work with Mother Earth rather than against her, using the materials she gives us, but re-engineering them, using modern science. I'm not antediluvian. You combine the best of the new, the best of the future with the best of the past, and the best of what Mother Earth gives us. That's the economy we need. Not this ludicrous idea that we can carry on pursuing a 19th century idea of free trade while leaving half the population of the country behind, and at the same time leaving Europe. I mean, what an incredible... That's the strategy of our government. At least Trump has a strategy. It's called, and it is actually reshoring. I'm not sure he'll succeed. Personally, I very much doubt it. I mean, we know a little about Donald Trump from Scotland, and his golf courses in Aberdeen is not exactly a resounding success. But we'll see. Time will tell. But if we just reshored food, fibre and fuel, that will be a way back. But then, what about energy? Well, the same man who has given us the worst political and economic crisis and diplomatic crisis this country has faced since at least the Suez crisis. At least. And arguably this is more damaging in the long term, and will be, to Britain's interests than Suez. The same man, just a few months before, announced that, oh, British people don't like wind farms, so we're not going to have any more. And his Chancellor announced that, oh, well, solar power is just too damn expensive, so we're not going to have any feed-in tariffs anymore. And within 6 months, they almost completely destroyed the solar power industry, and they're beginning to run down the shore-based wind industry. So, how do you bring back the left behind? You reshore some of the industries you took away. That's already happening in parts of the United States. It's not happening much here. But one of the best ways of reshoring the energy industry is to use Britain's wind. Now, I have an app on my phone which shows me wind around the world. I'm not clever enough to stick it up on here right now, but it shows you what many of us know, particularly if you live in Edinburgh. This is the windiest country on earth. We are the windiest nation in terms of, if you think about the knots, the speed of wind, and you put that number against average, against the number of people, each hair on every human head in Britain receives more wind power, speed, than any other human head, gathering of human heads in a nation on the planet. So we have a lot of wind. We've got a huge amount of wind. It's the most powerful indigenous onshore source of energy available to us in this country. It's far more powerful than the sun. And David Cameron, in the context of a debate where he was going to say to people, we're going to give you back control, announced that the government was going to stop allowing the generation of onshore energy through the use of wind. You kind of couldn't make it up. It's absolutely incredible. And actually, he did it, he said it's too expensive. But offshore wind is about 10 times as expensive as onshore wind, but they're going to allow offshore wind to continue, but not onshore wind. And a recent survey, when people were asked what they thought when they saw a wind turbine, in England, they said 80% use the word hope. 80% use the word hope. They said, it makes me feel hopeful. And so he just lied. He stood up in the House of Commons and said the British people don't like wind farms. It's absolute rubbish. You would only think that if you only ever read the Daily Telegraph and Tory party briefings, which presumably he does. And my father still does too, and I sometimes read it myself to find out what my father thinks before I go and stay with him. to arm myself, because I don't want to be responsible for raising his blood pressure any higher. He's a little older than me. So, how do we think back into the past in ways that help us to think about the present and the future and our current predicament? Well, I've slightly overrun there. Let's try and get back to the previous slide. Still learning the ways of this device. Come on, go back. Has it gone back? No. It's got stuck. Well, let's stick with the Reformation then. Oh, it's just cut off altogether. I seem to have lost power, lost control over my... Man, it's really quite sleepy, isn't it? Okay, so, if you go back 500 years, you get to a time when this device is not cooperating anymore. When people had more assets locally, they were more locally owned. So, but we, modern citizens, may be defined as individuals, I put it there, who have ceased to share, to own much common ground. We know about land title. We have the ability to buy and sell, or at least rent homes. We're accustomed to paying licenses or user fees for water, electricity, internet, access, fuel and transportation devices, as well as cash, food and clothing. Even access to unpolluted or relatively clean air to breathe may depend now on financial circumstances for modern people, or on property ownership and status. So very poor persons in Beijing, Delhi, and London and Los Angeles, and even rich people in those same cities, may live close to highways, sewage works, chemical works, be forced to breathe very bad air. And so the idea of access locally to the assets given us originally by God to create a sustainable economy, that access has diminished because so much of the earth is now turned into money. But of course, by the time of the Tudor Reformation, one of the effects of the monastic economy, part of the Holy Roman Empire, was that much of the economy belonged to one organization. It wasn't the European Union, of course, or Commission, or it wasn't the Amazon, or Google. It was the Holy Roman Empire. So when Henry Tudor had his matter with the Pope, and started to look for indigenous ways to resolve it, he found that 2/3 of the land of his kingdom belonged largely to the French, because it belonged to French religious orders, and the mother houses were ultimately the owners of property in the monastic lands. So Oliver Cromwell, Thomas Cromwell, set off to dissolve this foreign force of economic power and reshore economic control over the assets that had been effectively parcelled up in the course of people giving money so that prayers could be said for their souls in the next life, and re-Englishize it. You have to say in a way that Cromwell was rather more intelligent than Theresa May for that. Or certainly Cromwell, well, perhaps intelligence is the wrong word, but he at least had a plan. But of course, the Lutheran and Calvinist reformations in mainland Europe were very different from our Reformation. The Lutheran and Calvinist reformations led to the reassertion of the rights of the individual, the idea of the individual. And they resisted the idea of the common good. Because the common good, which had been derived, the idea of the common good was derived from Aristotle. And it had led to a highly collectivized form of society in medieval Europe. Whereas I just said many of the assets belonged to religious houses. And this led to a sense that people's lives were controlled by the church. So, for example, abbots would fight people to prevent them milling their own wheat, because the abbots wanted to have the fees for payment when they ground the grains. So you got illicit, a bit like illicit stills, you had illicit grinding stones, which, go back tens of thousands of years. The idea that you shouldn't be free to grind your own seed if you want to, but people were not free to do that. Because the abbot wanted to have control, he wanted the fees. So, but on the other hand, in the late Middle Ages then, the whole idea of the common good began to get mixed up with the collectivization of the power of Rome, the power of religion over people's lives, and it wasn't only economic, of course, it was spiritual. So your salvation depended upon your access to the economy of grace. And that divine economy was increasingly mixed up with St. Peter's and with the Pope and with the Vatican and with your ability to buy your way to heaven by purchasing indulgences, which was famously the point where Martin Luther finally kind of said, enough. And you can still do that today. If you walk through the gate in Rome in the Year of Mercy, which is now over last year, that Pope Francis announced with that wonderful Sone Lumiere of endangered species on the walls of the Vatican. So we give it a kind of green tinge. But if you walk through the gates of the Vatican in that year, you got time off, purgatory. So they do still believe this. It's still in the catechism. But we don't. That's a crucial difference between Catholic and Protestant Europe. But there's also a difference between Protestant Europe and Britain. And that's my point. In Europe, the reassertion of the idea of the individual did not lead to the kind of free-for-all and at the same time centralization that occurred in Britain. Switzerland, for example, their Reformation led to an extraordinarily powerful idea of the canton as the appropriate place of political power and sovereignty. So that to this day, it's cantons that decide things like, well, we have GM foods in supermarkets in Switzerland, we have a basic income. It's decided in the cantons to this day. It's a real democracy. And that's, to me, much more than the one we have here. And I think this is true all over reformed Europe. The guilds from the medieval era endured, of course they did in Britain too, but they've endured to this day in many parts of Europe and continue to have influence in the workplace. So not everything medieval was trashed, including not every part of the medieval economy, in the same way that it was in Britain. Henry Tudor, as I said already, had a different approach. As I said already, and I'm sort of repeating myself here, so I'll go quickly. He wanted to break the throne. He needed the money. He needed the assets of the monastery to fight the wars he wanted to carry on fighting in France, at the same time as organise his divorce. But the dissolution of the monasteries led to a vast centralisation in Britain of economic power and of assets. It didn't lead to a new redistribution of power between individuals and collectivities. It led to a situation where people found themselves in communities where the monastic economy had gone. The land had been, sometimes the control had gone to Whitehall, sometimes it'd end up in Trinity College, Cambridge, or Christ Church College, Oxford, because Thomas Cromwell used and Wolsey used the assets sometimes to found institutions like Christ Church, which was, well, it predates the Reformation, but they used it to enrich them and found new ones. And then, quite often, what Whitehall did, what the King did and Cromwell did, was to use the assets to buy what is now called the monopoly of violence. So a nation-state, one definition by social scientists of nation-state, is a place where one authority has a monopoly of violence. So we were arguably the first European nation to arrange a monopoly of violence. So how did they do that? They used land to buy the fealty of aristocratic families who could raise private armies. And in so doing, they bought their fealty, they reduced the likelihood that lords would ever fight the English crown, and at the same time, they increased the likelihood that some of the income from the lands would come back to Whitehall to help Henry in his wars. Well, this is telling a history lesson, but it is very interesting, and it's important to tell it because Wolf Hall is so appallingly misleading about what Thomas Cromwell actually did. If anybody reads those novels or has listened to them, I think they've even been televised. Thomas Cromwell was no saint, and the idea that he didn't like burning people is absolute nonsense. But anyway, that's another matter. My real point is, though, that to understand the break between Britain and Europe culturally, you have to go back to this religious history. The economic outcomes of the Reformation in Britain were different than they were in most of Europe, it seems to me. Now, I don't find many scholars have reflected on this, oddly, but I'm still going to make the claim. I think it's true. So here we have Martin Luther, and if I can just get up the... No, this is Munster. I'm just trying to get up... It's not incredibly cooperative, this slide. Yeah, here we are. I'll skip the last one. So, arguably then, when an academic says arguably, it means that what they're about to say is not accepted by every single historian, and you can argue with them afterwards. So you can argue with me afterwards. So England, Scotland and Wales were arguably the first places where, in the 100 or so years after the dissolution of the monasteries, a mobile army of labour was created. And these people were forced onto the roads and waste grounds. Vagrancy that was then criminalised. And this led to Tess of the D'Urbervilles, a novel again which I'm sure many of you know. So Tess is in Thomas Hardy's romantic elegy to the rural economy that had been lost. She stands as the sort of symbol of what it meant for people in rural England, to criminalise vagrancy while their economy, their assets, had been stolen from them by rich people. And where did these people end up? They ended up on the parish, as it was known, in workhouses, where they had to earn their porridge in the morning, effectively. And you see on the walls of the workhouse, it says on one of them, God is good, and God is just. In other words, this is God's doing that you are here. It is God's doing that you're poor. It is God's doing that the rich stole the land from the church and from the poor and are using it for their own purposes and have made you homeless. So The British people then did not experience a great inauguration of democracy after the Reformation in the way that Europe did. There were elements of that democracy, so book printing, for example, literacy. Yeah, these were crucial elements of it. But the House of Commons in Britain, after the failed Civil War, I mean, failed if you were on the side of the Roundheads, the House of Commons was used by the rich who'd already got a lot of land off the king to steal the rest of the land. Hundreds and hundreds of acts of enclosure. So this went on for 200 years, the theft by the rich from the poor of their assets. And then I think the other interesting thing here, and this is new, and I've had more than one PhD student ask me afterwards, what's the source of that claim? And I said, well, my brain. I don't know that I've got any other source for it. But I think that the post-Reformation tendencies of Anglo-Saxon England towards aristocratic, sovereign, and corporate centralisation led to liberal individualism. It led to, ultimately, which was the root of neoliberalism. So the first person, really the originator of modern liberal thought, the idea that an individual is first and foremost an individual, not a child, either of their mother and father and the earth. That idea came from Thomas Hobbes, who was reflecting on the Civil War and its outcome. It came from John Locke, and related liberal ideas from Adam Smith and Tom Paine. These people were hugely influential in the history of modernity. They were read by the Germans before they thought of their own new ideas in the Enlightenment. And then they were read by the Americans and the French before their respective revolutions. They were hugely influential in forming the modern world. But the ideas they put out there were a reaction to the excessive centralisation the Reformation led to in Britain. So the core conceptions of liberal individualism, to me, were formed in opposition to government by an elite or social hierarchy, and played key roles. I'm a huge fan of Thomas Paine, as it happens, and I've read a lot of his stuff. So, and then of course they were revived in the teachings of this man, Ferdinand Hayek. This idea that the individual is sovereign, the individual is free, the individual is first and foremost alone. He goes to the marketplace alone, without attachments, and he must trade there without attachments, and this will ultimately make for the common good. This is the neoliberal belief. And here he is lecturing, and I don't know which one Keynes is, but Keynes, I think, is on the left, looking up at him with the glasses on, in the London School of Economics. So these ideas, which came from a reaction to the British Reformation in terms of its outcome, were then revived in the late 20th century as a reaction to another kind of collectivization, which I described already a little bit earlier. The collectivization of economics, of the New Deal, and then, of course, German National Socialism, which the Austrian Hayek had known at first hand. And we are now, we're now living in the midst of the continued outgrowth of all that. So, essentially then, it's wrong simply to kind of oppose neoliberalism and Christianity. In some very important ways, Christianity is deeply implicated in neoliberal economics. So it's not surprising that there are strong associations between neoliberals and Catholics, and Catholic thought, because Catholics were also very critical of the state in the 19th century and of state collective projects, because they saw it as a threat to the freedom of the church over, for example, determined matters to do with human sexual relationships and reproduction, just for one area, but many other areas. And that continues right through much of the 20th century, and magisterium is critique, including of democracy. And the magisterium doesn't really reconcile itself to democracy until after Vatican II, actually. So it's wrong to say, oh, it's a pagan. I mean, I sometimes describe neoliberalism as a pagan philosophy, but that's actually somewhat simplistic. It is pagan in the sense it worships inanimate objects rather than soul, rather than God. But it has some roots in Christian history and the Christian tradition. But the common good, and getting back to the common good, involves recognition that of the legitimacy, as I put it here, or even of the, I'm going to stand at the back, might make it easy to read this slide, or even divine authority of certain forms of common or independent ownership of, or at least in counterbalance with, ensouled individuals. So certain forms of collectivity, including the church, or at least the local church, the trade or merchant guild, or this is the guild hall of York City, city councils or governments, regional and national judicial courts, regional and national governments, and business corporations. So the political means all of these things, from the local right out to the global, if we have something like the United Nations and a big corporation like Shell or Google. All of them ultimately are part of the political. But what I think has happened in the Anglo-Saxon liberalism is a reaction to the over-centralisation of all of these things into Whitehall, playing itself out in history. And then in the Brexit Trump experience, you have a related reaction, where people have said, no, we're not free. This assertion of freedom by the centre, the cosmopolitan centre, has left the periphery behind. And that's why we have Brexit and Trump. So you see, I'm trying to argue for a kind of historical, even theological and philosophical parallel here. So one of the key liberals, of course, was this man, John Locke, and his assertion of individualism against government and collective power is, I think, evident still in pro-life movements against family planning and prenatal terminations of pregnancies in the US and beyond, because the ideas of Locke led to very peculiar ideas about property and control over property, and so political arguments about the status of the fetus, or even of a woman's body, I think are weirdly related to a kind of distortion of Lockean arguments about who owns the earth and who ought to control it. So I think Locke's influence in the United States also plays into the whole Trump vote, the vote for Trump, much of which came from Catholic and evangelical Christians who wanted to take away the ability of the state to fund either contraception or birth control or abortions. Now, I'm not pro-abortion, but what's happening is that they're going to reduce the access of poor people to the ability to control the number of pregnancies they have, which will lead to more abortions, not less. It's completely mad. But I come out of a kind of perversion of Lockean liberalism. And it's a kind of anti-liberalism, reasserting the right of the prenatal child, but it fails, I think, to assert the rights of postnatal children. If for a result of the Trump policies, as was announced in Congress, that they're going to reduce regulation and pollution, and postnatal children are harmed by sulfur pollution from coal chimneys. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis, I think, made a number of crucial moves in reforming the magisterium, including its critique of the state. But I think the most important one was to define the common good of humanity and the earth through this phrase, integral ecology. And he said integral ecology is inseparable from the notion of the common good. And then in Vatican II, before him, of course, long before him, in Gaudium et Spes, the common good was defined with reference to the conditions that would make it possible for human persons and groups to achieve their own fulfillment. But in Gaudium et Spes, the role of the environment was not highlighted. It did highlight the importance, for example, of distribution of assets and wealth, but it didn't highlight the needs of people to have some degree of agency in their own local places, in their own local environments. And the Pope absolutely gets this. Now, some people say that Christianity isn't an ecological religion, or even that it's anti-ecological. But this is the apse. It's a 10th century mosaic in the Church of San Clemente in Rome, but it's said to be a copy of a much older mosaic. And you can see in this apse this extraordinary mandala-like visual structure of salvation. Now, what the Pope argued in Laudato Si was that creatures are part of God's salvation. And that's already in this very old visual depiction of the effects of salvation, where you see all the different species and the earth itself being given life by the tree. This is a tree of life, literally, visually unfolded. Now, for Francis, in the account of integral ecology, the idea of land as a gift rather than a commodity is put forward, a divine gift. And he makes a number of other points. He argues that all non-humans, all species, will in some way that is mysterious to us, but in some way be caught up and redeemed in the eschaton. And he has some very practical things. He refers to the needs of people in cities for green spaces, unpolluted air, for beauty and design of public buildings and squares, for unpolluted water not sold to them by private corporations. And the vision of integral ecology also includes much now which is mainstream and radical environmentalism, and of course links back to the teachings of St. Francis. So this is a well-known image, but of course what Francis did was, as St. Francis did, to include the inclusion of Mother Earth in a conception of co-creaturely living agency in the definition of the common good. So he revised the medieval definition in very important ways, and in particular in his emphasis on the rights of indigenous and poor people who currently experience, much like Thomas Cromwell's dissolution of the monasteries, government is stealing their assets, on their rights to retain their assets and not to be excluded. And this applies equally to the left behind, the deindustrialised communities who voted for Brexit and Trump, it seems to me. Not everything that Francis said was new, of course. Pope Benedict had made some very similar statements. In particular, Francis repeated the point that absent Christian belief, this idea of the common good as incorporated in the flourishing of persons on the planet would not be embraced by people. And I think this is very critical in relation to the Brexit and Trump votes, neither of which I think were particularly Christian in orientation. But I'm just going to skip this slide. But this is a man called John Milbank, who's recently written a book, a friend of mine, called The Politics of Virtue. And he argues that the idea of the common good involved the unique fusion of virtue, politics and ethics, which underwrote the social collective institutions of the guild, city government, and even argued the sovereign power of monarchs and states, through which the common good was instantiated and sustained in Britain and Europe, Catholic and Protestant. The existential question for Europeans then is whether this uniquely European legacy of commitment to the civil common good, to civitas, will be sustained in societies where church-going and Christian belief decline as rapidly as they have in contemporary Western Europe. But how would those who voted for Brexit and Trump read what I've just said? And then maybe some Brexit voters here, I don't know, some Leave voters here, and so I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Would you accept this idea of the common good, and particularly the attempt to revise it to include the earth and other creatures? I think some would dismiss the inclusion of Mother Earth in the definition of the good towards which human activities ought to be directed, because despite the anti-liberal programmes on which both Brexit and Trump were sold, Brexit and Trump politicians remain deeply neoliberal in their approach to economic matters, and so much what I've been saying in the last few minutes is resistant to that. Milbank makes another very interesting point about the unique position of Britain. On the face of it, the Brexit vote was about subsidiarity, about the return of sovereign control of UK borders, UK legislation, and UK public spending to priority set in Britain in the interest of ordinary British people. But this desire, Milbank says, may also reflect a distinctly British conception of state sovereignty, which arguably secularised the authority of the church, rather than acknowledging the ultimate submission of the secular to the spiritual. It's a complex thought. But again, I think they're getting at the ideological and the historical difference between this very British idea of a fusion of spiritual and secular power we have in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and with still a reigning monarch, and in all the other countries of Europe. So there are many cultural factors that are in play here. But what I find most incredible, and I sort of come back close to the beginning of the lecture here, is that when you actually look at the vision of those who are now enacting Brexit, it's not a vision of reshoring. What they're saying is we'll be freer after we leave Europe to trade with the world than we were before. It's complete rubbish, in my opinion, but that's what they're saying. They aren't talking about reshoring. They aren't talking about relocalising. They aren't talking about a sustainable economy, growing more food in Britain, growing more construction materials in Britain, deriving more energy from the land of Britain. No, apart from fracking, that is. No, they're talking about going out to sea again in ships, to trade with the world, like the Cutty Sark that I used to take my girlfriends to visit when I lived in London. So what we need is subsidiarity, is the project, is to reskill, to return political and economic agency to local communities, to the left behind, to the cities and the regions, and to the rural areas, which also voted almost universally for Brexit. We need to reshore and agency and power into rural areas and redistribute economic assets back to the regions. But that's not happened. Under Osborne, the regions have been more centralised than ever before because he stole half of the income of the regions in the name of saving the banks and saving the British Exchequer, and despite that, the national debt has more than doubled since the Conservative, Democrat, whatever they call themselves, Condem, came into power. Absolutely extraordinary. But the factories largely have gone. The left behind voted against this. But what we're told by Whitehall is, no, we're still going to trade with the world, we're still not going to rebuild the factories, we're still going to live off the sea, we'll just make new trade deals with the foreign British Empire. But Australia isn't interested. They've found ways to live without us now. We're not going to go back to the 1960s. It's quite completely incredible. Well, obviously, in the next half of the day, we're going to move on to some more positive visions, to think about how we respond to all this, and perhaps to critique. I've talked a bit longer than I intended, but there's only one formal lecture today, so you won't get another one like this afternoon, just in case you're worrying. So I want to give us lots of time to process all this. But I do start to think, in these last few slides, about some hints at what the positive response might be. Liberalism, as I put it here, and its economic reassertion and neoliberalism lives on after Brexit and shows no signs of being revised yet amongst our governing elite in the direction of either Mother Earth or local communities, giving power back. Both such revisions require recognition, sadly missing in traditional Anglo-Saxon anti-collectivist versions of liberalism, that human life as well as the earth are divine gifts received from God, other persons and the environment. The giving and receiving of gifts requires recognition among all parties to exchanges, and individuals exist in and by reciprocal relationships, and that these relationships require to be nurtured and sustained in forms of collective and customary arrangements which people deliberate over if they are to be mutually beneficial. We need a political economy which is democratically deliberated over locally and democratically shared and owned by them all. This requires, in other words, that there is something called a common good, which individuals need locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally, continually, to meet face-to-face like the community does here in the common room to discuss. So how are we going to govern ourselves today? Who's going to do the washing up? Who's going to fix the broken plasterboard in the outhouse, and so on and so forth? That is the fundamental activity of a democracy that's working, and giving agency back to people. For me, the other key question about all this is how to connect up this movement of reaction to neoliberalism and the need to recover a more ecological understanding of what we're doing on this earth. And for me, this may be a source of hope in all of this. From the perspective of someone who's long campaigned for the local over the global as a way to achieve a more sustainable economy, the question is how can we, on the one hand, persuade the cosmopolitans that there's something in returning agency from London to the provinces, and from DC and so on, and that there's something else in recovering a sense of connectedness between the economy and Mother Earth. Bruno Latour, a famous French intellectual, puts it like this: we need alliances of those attracted to ecological understandings of the non-humans and those accused of reaction, archaism, and retreat. I don't know whether those alliances are going to be formed. Arguably, Transition Towns was one such alliance. I'm sure that some people in the transition movement voted to leave. So I think they do exist in nascent forms. But let's also think about some assets that we might have in British culture in reshoring and relocalising. So think about Wind in the Willows. In Wind in the Willows, the whole issue of things coming in that you don't want, migrants and speed and movement, are kind of nicely satirised and complexified. And what you find in Wind in the Willows is what the Wiltshire-based academic Roger Scruton calls oikophilia, rather than oikophobia. So you can think of Toad Oil as oikophobic, because he's always trying to get away from home in some speedy device or other, and Ratty and Mole and Badger as oikophilic. They know where they belong, they want to defend where they belong against speed and pollution and craziness for all they're worth. So I think we do have a few resources for thinking about this. So here you have Toad, the mowers were eaten up, as he sped, he knew not whither, living his hour reckless of what might come to him. But he's driving through, it could almost be Dorset, couldn't it? A beautiful landscape. So I think we do have some cultural assets for starting to at least sort of cover a more positive vision of oikophilia. Yeah, I just missed the words there, but it's just going to behave itself. Let's move on to the next slide. Yeah. Almost the last one now. Okay, my other favourite metaphor for oikophilia, love of home, and the fight against a kind of global warring Mordor, is of course The Lord of the Rings. It's amazing how many environmentalists have read The Lord of the Rings. It's of course a post-Christian myth, in some ways pre-Christian, deeply influenced by Anglo-Saxon mythology, but it's also many elements of Christian mythology in it. One of the most extraordinary moments in The Lord of the Rings is when the trees get up and walk. The trees don't move. Okay, if you're an aspen, you can put out lots of shoots underground, and so you can birth and nurture trees hundreds of yards away if the aspen gets old enough and big enough. So in that way, you could argue aspens do sort of move a bit. But if you're an oak tree, okay, you can shed acorns, but you do not move. Stay in one place. So there are absolutely classic examples of rooted beings, rooted in the earth, reaching up to the sky, with bronchia, just like in our lungs, as symbols of life. And in Lord of the Rings, it's like the war between iron and steel and global collective forces, like Nazi Germany, which was gathering already in Europe when Lord of the Rings was being written. And the local, the Shire, where there is still agency and ability to grow and to nurture and to plant and to harvest. That war finally leads to the most stationary creatures getting up and joining on the side of the Shire, on the side of the little people. It's a fabulous image, and it's there in Lord of the Rings. Now, to me, all of this means that I think we need to think again about industrial farming in Britain. We have a tremendous opportunity to do that now, because instead of the insanity of the common agricultural policy, we'll have to rethink what we do with farm subsidies. In my view, we need to subsidise organic agriculture above everything else, because organic agriculture produces all the ecosystem services that we need to sustain this country, and doesn't have any of the social costs, pollution of the water table, pesticides, and reduced nutrients in the food system. Nor does it have the animal welfare costs of the large industrial systems such as this one here. So we do have, it seems to me, tremendous opportunities. My concern is that the British elite will not use these opportunities for these ways. But we can think again, we're going to spend the rest of the day thinking about opportunities now together, and we'll come back later into a plenary to discuss those. So I've got nothing against love of home. That's what I'm trying to say to you. I am a cosmopolitan, but I have absolutely nothing against love of home. I think Roger Scruton is right. Sometimes cosmopolitans are oikophobic. They sort of fear home. They're always running away from it, like Toad. But love of home and the desire to protect it from development is often described as NIMBYism by cosmopolitans. But you see, I'm not opposed to NIMBYism. I just want there to be NIMBYism everywhere. So look at this. I took this slide a few months ago in Somerset. So this is a village of Box. They're against local fracking. So they don't mind if there's fracking in North Dakota. There can be fracking in Lancashire for all they care. They don't care about earthquakes in Blackpool. They just don't want there to be earthquakes in Box. No, I'm against fracking. I'm against local fracking and global fracking. Because I want every community whose water table is at risk of being poisoned by fracking to have the political power to say no. But George Osborne didn't. So when the people of Lancashire, through their local democracy, said no, George Osborne overruled them. He's just another Thomas Cromwell. He just wants to centralise power. They're not going to give the British people back control. This is nonsense. But also, of course, in that same area, on the way to give a related talk to this one, I passed the pub. The slide has gone again. And it was called here we are, the Flemish Weaver. I don't know the pub names around here. I haven't been here long. I haven't seen any pubs very close to Hilfield. You've probably got some similar ones. But just to come back to the beginning really again, let's not fool ourselves. We remain a European country after Brexit. We remain a country of European Christian customs, which go back at least 1,000 years. And many of the best things still in Britain have endured from that time. And let's hope to goodness that whatever these people do in Whitehall, we can conserve them. So, for me then, we have to live within limits if we want to conserve the earth. That's why liberalism is ultimately wrong. Individuals belong to other people. They're born in relationships with other people. The freedoms, the four freedoms, need to be constrained by the needs of others, the needs of the poor, the needs of the left behind, and the needs of the earth. And that constraint needs to come out of negotiated deliberations of access to commons, assets, and the common good. This is best done locally and regionally, and not in Whitehall or Brussels or Paris or New York. That was what Agenda 21 was all about, by the way, in 1992. But Anglo-Saxon liberalism at its core has always resisted this, because it has been the creed of individualist landowners and land grabbers and settlers on other people's shores who were driven away by that collectivisation process. And that's where I see the connection between Trump and Brexit. But despite Elon Musk's and Stephen Hawking's hopes, Mars isn't going to substitute for a habitable Earth anytime soon. If we want to carry on living here, we've got to learn to live together, locally, and not only globally. Thank you very much for listening. I took a bit longer than I meant to, but I do apologise. But please, I look forward to your interaction.